So the United States is now approaching China for help to avoid a global recession. And this is quite groundbreaking because it tells us that despite all the rhetoric of China being the enemy, America still needs China to function and maybe even to bail them out of a crisis. We had Janet Yellen of the US Treasury traveling to Davos in Switzerland to meet with China's Vice Premier Liu He to talk macroeconomics and finance. And let's understand that this meeting was arranged by Yellen and she traveled all the way just to talk to China. So something has fundamentally shifted, and the US realizes that it can't fight too many economic battles at once. Remember that the US is funding a very expensive war in Ukraine, and they have now an insane debt crisis going on at this moment. So they cannot afford to have another financial crisis on the Eastern Front. And according to Yellen, we should not allow misunderstandings to worsen our bilateral economic and financial relationship. America has a lot of concern, and we need to analyze if this communication is truly genuine or just another smoke show, right? Because China and America, they are still at odds with each other. Both sides wants to push their agenda to the world, and real cooperation might be impossible. And let's understand that there are multiple storms converging on the US all at once. It's going to get pretty ugly if they just stand still. Now, the first is the US GDP growth in 2023, which is expected to slow down dramatically. We have a consensus that real GDP growth is going to crash to 0.3%, with unemployment rising to an average of 4.4%. And other estimates from the conference board tells us that GDP will plunge to 0.2% in 2023, which is just a hair's breadth away from negative growth. And this is not good news, guys. It's very likely we are going to recession this year, and the signs are showing. We have big banks like Goldman firing thousands of workers because they know a deep recession is coming and they are pulling the trigger first. Plus, the tech industry is already on fire. Just between Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, we are looking at 40,000 jobs being terminated, and that is a disaster. And it's telling us that the US and the world at large cannot survive a high interest rate environment. Now, the second storm is a bigger one and it's hitting the US right here, right now, and that is the debt ceiling crisis, right? America once again has hit the debt limit, and this time it's $31.4 trillion. That's a ton of money. If they default, it's going to send inflation soaring even further because all those dollars, they're just going to rush back to the US, and no one will want to hold US currency anymore because all trust is gone. Social Security will implode, and the entire fabric of America will collapse if a default happens. And China will have a big part to play in this debt crisis. And the last storm is the dollarization tsunami coming for the US, and this is the biggest disaster of the lot. And by now, we already know the story. The Saudis are looking to move past the dollar, the threat of sanctions is always looming, and the currency crisis last year has woken up central banks. And all this is encouraging the world to dump dollars, and this isn't good news for the US. And that's why we have Yellen talking with China. She knows China holds the key to slowing down the dollarization because the US has to protect the petrodollar at all costs. But here's the big question, guys. Can China's reopening really save the United States and the world from a global recession? Why do you think Yellen really met with Liu He, right? It's because China has pivoted from the mass lockdowns to restarting their economy. And this is going to be big because China is still the world's largest consumer of energy and still the world's largest factory. And according to JP Morgan, China is expected to have a 4% GDP growth in 2023, beating all other estimates around the world, higher than 1% in the US and 1.6% globally. And this is the idea Yellen probably has in her mind, right? China's reopening means that they can flood the US with tons of cheap goods, reducing our inflation. And at the same time, the Chinese consumer base will come in and buy tons of American-made stuff. So if US-China trading relations are normalized, then the US can expect to benefit from the reopening because we have to understand the big winner of 2022 is China. After all the G7 price caps and sanctions on Russia, it is China that's sitting back and just enjoying cheap oil and gas from Putin, right? That big discount is helping to fuel China's growth faster, the opening faster than any other economy. And the energy inputs to China are much cheaper than the rest of the world. We have to understand that, right? So they can run their industries more competitively, or they can also just reroute the oil and gas to Europe and earn more money that way. And that's why we even had Germany approaching China to invest and tap into their markets. But will the US get the help they need from China? And can China really save the whole world or just its own economy? Because I have my own doubts. I think that the Fed hiking rates and keeping it high in the US is going to crush domestic demand much more than any slack Chinese consumers can really pick up. And considering the Chinese yuan is still down against the dollar, consumers will likely just buy their local products instead of importing American goods, right? So I really think Yellen's bucking up the wrong tree because a recession is nearly impossible to dodge at this point. And this brings us to what I think is the main reason for the meeting, guys. We know that China is leading the de-dollarization campaign against the US, and by now, it's not a secret. Apart from Japan, China is the largest foreign holder of US treasuries with $870 billion worth of American bonds, and that is almost 12% of all foreign holdings, which is a ton of US debt. And China's de-dollarization playbook is pretty simple, right? They have been dumping their treasury holdings month after month ever since February 2022 when the West froze Russian assets. And what is China doing with all that money? Let's have a think a bit. Oh, yes, they are buying gold instead, right? And it's really not a coincidence that China announced to the whole world they increased their gold reserves. In fact, the whole country is importing gold with Swiss exports hitting a 4-year high in 2022. It's not just the central bank buying. Local Chinese people, they are buying gold for investment and jewelry. And this is not going to stop. When you buy gold, you're actually selling dollars out at the same time. And I think this is the real reason the US is freaking out, because if China can survive dumping treasuries and the price of gold keeps going up, it is telling the world they can also survive outside of the dollar system. So it won't be a surprise if Janet Yellen is asking China to reverse course and buy back up all those treasuries. The problem with a treasury dump is that it jacks up rates and drags the US deeper into a debt crisis, right? We know the US is going to keep deficit spending going. They cannot afford to stop. They have tons of obligations. They have to meet like Social Security and all those weapons being shipped to Ukraine. And in fact, according to the Congressional Budget Office, US Social Security could be bankrupt by 2033. In just 10 years, the trust fund reserves could actually hit zero. So to fund this, America has to borrow money. There's no alternative. And like any debtor, it's always better to borrow money at a lower interest rate than at a higher one. And this is what I believe the main agenda is, which is to remove pressure from the US economy until the debt crisis and the Ukraine issue gets sorted out. It is unsustainable for the US to keep borrowing money to fund the war and pay off their obligations at a 3 to 4 to 5% interest rate. It will bankrupt the country sooner or later. But here's the big question. Will China play ball? Will they help the Americans as they reopen and buy back US treasuries? Because if they do, it'll probably help the US tide through the debt crisis and buy them more time, more breathing room to fund the Ukraine conflict. However, it's likely the Chinese also want some concessions from the United States. And the first thing that comes to mind is to remove the tax sanctions on China, stop the war on chips, as well as to reverse friendshoring. And if you didn't know by now, the US is trying to stifle China's tech progress and encouraging business to outsource their production away from China, right? They're trying to shift the supply chain away to friendly countries like Japan and South Korea. And this is obviously hurting the Chinese economy and it's making any cooperation near impossible. It has to be a give and take relationship or it won't really work. As Zoltan Poza of Credit Suisse pointed out, we are moving towards a new world order where the West and the East, they're at odds with each other, right? Globalization is really breaking down. And he mentioned how America is moving to rearm and reshore their industries. And that's why we are seeing so many policies that are anti-China. And because of this, if China were to buy treasuries or other G7 debt claims, they will be effectively funding the West's own effort against themselves. So unless Janet Yellen comes to the table with a really good offer, right, like pulling away the tax sanctions on Beijing, I really don't think China will play along, they'll play ball and help out the Americans. But here's the truth, guys. China's going to keep de-dollarizing, getting out of US treasuries as much as possible and shifting their money to assets like gold. Yes, there's a lot of handshaking going on right now. We have Yellen even planning to visit China in 2023, and it's a really positive step, I get it. But if they want China to play ball, then there has to be some benefits like dropping the tax sanctions. But here's the thing, guys, that's going to be quite hard for the US to do. All we need to look at is Yellen's trip to Zambia, calling China a barrier to debt reform in Africa, and the Chinese they hit back, asking America to fix their own debt problems. They mentioned how the biggest contribution that the US can make to the debt issues outside the country is to act on responsible monetary policies and cope with its own debt problem, which I have to agree with because the dollar is the world reserve currency. Any policy, good or bad, will have a big ripple effect on the world economy. And we have seen that with the currency crisis back in 2022 when the Federal Reserve they actually lifted rates. And the same goes if the US keeps borrowing money endlessly. So I know that we all hope for US China tensions to die down and for the world economy to stabilize again, but unless the US drops all the sanctions, the tariffs of China, I don't think Beijing is going to help out. They're going to keep dumping treasuries holding just the minimum amount of US bonds necessary for trade. And they're going to push for more yuan trade in the Middle East, especially in Saudi Arabia. Yes, what we are seeing today is a good step, much better than another escalation, but it'll take much more than just a few meetings to stop the de-dollarization train. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Will the US drop their sanctions on China? Will the Chinese actually help out the US and buy back all those treasuries in 2023? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these insane times.